So pretty early in my undergraduate program, I got very, very into My Hero Academia, which had just started at the time that I started reading it. After some time passed, I don't remember how much, but I severely hope that it was not very long due to where the story was going. I started to get really into it, and I actually started reading fan fiction for it. There have only been a handful of things in my life that I actually had the curiosity to read fan fiction for, and My Hero Academia was one of them. This was, I think, before season 2 even came out. And I started reading some of the fanfic, and I found that it sucked. It was really bad. So I decided that I could do better, and I found this one fanfic that I just hated so much. It was like, I think it was like 1,500 words. And I'm not going to tell you what it was about because I do not want people to go find this. But there was this fanfic that was like 1,500 words, and I thought it was just so aggressively stupid that I had to write my own that was better. Now, of course, I actually ended up meeting the person who wrote it, and I never told her that I hated her fanfic so much. I told her that it inspired mine, and that I was so glad she wrote it, and so glad that I got to read it. But the reason I wrote it was because I thought her fanfic was so bad. And so I got super into this. I wanted to write a very, very detailed, heavily researched, heavily thought out fanfic. I think it ended up being about 90,000 words. For like a year, I was working on it like 3 hours a day. I was either planning or writing or editing 3 hours a day. I walked a lot of places at the time, so I spent a lot of time listening to music, and I had a playlist that helped me think about and plan my fanfiction. And people really, really liked it. I mean, I actually had live readers, which was very cool. Okay, sorry. I had one live reader. It was definitely the most popular fanfiction that I had ever written, but it was not the most popular fanfiction by far in My Hero Academia, and it wasn't even the most popular or the second most popular fanfiction for the fairly obscure relationship that it depicted. So what I'm getting at is the fanfic was good, but it was not like movie quality or anything like that. However, it was my pride and joy, and I was convinced, especially because all the other fanfiction was, in my opinion, so bad, that I was, basically a personal gift to the My Hero Academia fandom, and that more people needed to read my stuff. So I went to TV Tropes, and there's a fanfic rec page that the one rule is you cannot have written the fanfic that you wrote, or that you post, sorry. But I decided that my fanfiction was just so good that people would appreciate it anyway. So I put my fanfic on the fanfic recs page, and I left a little note that was like, admittedly, I did write this, but I've gotten so much positive feedback that I know it deserves to be here. And it was removed, obviously. I think I might have put it back and then it was removed again. I don't remember. I severely hope not, but I kind of think that it's a distinct possibility that happened. Anyway, I recognize now that what I did was obviously a dick move. And I have gone back and read that fanfic in the years since, and it's not that great. I mean, it's definitely better than the average fanfiction, but, the average fanfiction is bad. So, low bar. So a couple of months ago, actually it was in November, Aaron Waltke, who wrote Prodigy, posted he's the co-executive producer, and he apparently oversaw most of the writing process and decided a lot of the major story movements, but he's no longer credited as a writer. But it is his creative mind that, spawned most of what happens in season 2. He tweeted out that he had just finished going over the final edit for season 2 of Prodigy, and he said that it was like, I don't remember the exact phrase, I'll put the tweet up here, but he said that it was, just this incredibly moving and wonderful piece of art. And I remember the phrase, "The world needs to see this." And as hyped as I was for Prodigy Season 2 at the time, that tweet actually made me less excited for Season 2 because, of course you think the world needs to see it. You wrote it, man. I also felt that the world needed to read my fan fiction when I was 19. But I have to concede defeat on this one. Prodigy Season 2 is so good. I almost said a profanity there. I am repeatedly blown away by what they are able to achieve in the amount of time that they take to achieve it, and especially relative to what has come before. I found it really difficult to praise Season 1 of Prodigy in a way that made it sound interesting for potential new viewers, because everything that I wanted to say about it made the rest of Star Trek sound so bad, right? I would try to say things like, it's a Star Trek series that tells an actual story, or it's a Star Trek series that actually has consistent and a focus on character development, or it's a Star Trek series that actually respects the audience's intelligence. And I knew that if I said that, Star Trek fans who checked it out would go into it looking for its flaws, which is not what I wanted. But Prodigy Season 2 so far has been to Season 1 what Season 1 was to the average Star Trek series for me. It has just been hit after hit, incredible story decision after incredible story decision. The French people who got to see this first kept saying on Reddit and stuff that this season was the best single season of Trek that had ever been made. And I did my level best to not believe them, because I did not want to be disappointed. But I think at this point, I think we can almost know that they are going to end up being right. I will admit that my standards are lower for Prodigy, and I try to mitigate that when I use phrases like best single season of Star Trek ever made, and so on and so forth. But so far, the worst part of this season has been like the closing 2 minutes of episode 13, which we'll get to. It was just kind of mid, where for the rest of Star Trek that I've seen, it's really, really great if 40% of the episodes are memorable. So episodes 11 and 12 of this season, or 31 and 32 of the series overall, focus on Chakotay, and they're called The Last Flight of the Protostar. It basically picks up exactly where episode 30 left, with the children arriving on this mostly barren planet where Chakotay has marooned himself. I had just finished recording last week's video when I started watching this, and towards the end of last week's video, I talked about how Dal thinks that going out in some kind of supernova is a way that he can be somebody. You know, if he dies going down with the ship or sacrificing himself for his crew, then he will have achieved being someone, he can be satisfied with who he was because he knows he will be remembered in a certain way, and so on. This set of episodes opens on a 10-year montage of Chakotay trying to survive and trying to keep himself sane on this tiny island with the protostar, scraping fish eggs off of fish and spreading them on fruit. And I thought of this line from Hamilton. I really hoped it was said by Daveed Diggs, but it was not. But it goes, "Dying is easy, young man. Living is harder." This set of 2 episodes is basically about how, for one, Chakotay is an excellent role model for Dal, but for 2, he is, this is going to sound so obvious, but he is the natural, deserving captain of the Protostar. He is the captain of the Protostar that was always supposed to be. But 10 years ago, he lost most of his crew, and 5 years ago or something, his first officer, his last remaining crewmate, left. So he is alone and bitter and unsocialized and depressed. The children try to ask him for help and to tell him, hey, we neutralized the virus, you can come back to civilization, and he doesn't want to hear it. Up to this point in the season, we've been building up in Dal's mind this idea of Chakotay as this hero, someone he should try to emulate. For one, he is the captain of the Protostar, which is, the majority of Dal's identity. But for 2, he is this legendary person that Janeway loves and has described to him, and someone that Dal credits with the good things that have happened in his life. He met Chakotay one time for like 10 minutes and decided that Chakotay is this person worth looking up to. But the moment that Chakotay doesn't let them in, isn't interested in helping them immediately, it's like the illusion shatters and he loses all respect in Dal's eyes. Dal was always very hesitant to trust authority. In season 1, everybody else wanted to join Starfleet except for him because he said that Starfleet is just another name for another person in charge. And then it took him a while to be open to the idea of joining Starfleet. And then when he did, he still isn't fully on board with the idea of taking orders all of the time. So as soon as Chakotay proves to not be this perfect hero that Dal had built him up in his head to be, he just flips a 180 on him and lashes out at him, disrespects him publicly in front of the group. It's frankly very difficult to watch. I was going to bring this up later, but I am really, really glad that after this set of 2 episodes, Dal improves. I like Dal. I like Dal a lot. But he was honestly starting to wear a little bit thin on me. I understand that this series is about his character development, and it has been executed masterfully. But last season, he was a real jerk for the first, 5.5 episodes, and then he turned his act around. But here we were past the midway point in the season, and Dal had been a jerk since the beginning of this season. And it was really starting to grate on me. It was hard to watch, especially because you can tell that he's suffering. You know that he needs to change, but at the same time, he's lashing out at the people around him and mistreating them, and there's nothing they can really do about it because they know he's stubborn and they can't just, give him a hug and make the problem go away. What I was afraid was happening was that the show was trying to retcon all of the good that Dal had done last season. In episode 10, the flash forward of him says, "I was never meant for the chair." And I don't actually believe that's true. Like I said last week, I think Dal was the perfect person to lead last season, given his experience and mindset and the way he prioritizes things based on the situation that they were in. And I felt a little bit at this point like the show was trying to tell me that Dal has always been a disaster. He has not always been a disaster. He does need to grow up. He does need to figure himself out. But I was starting to get a little bit irritated by the fact that he was all jerk all the time. If it had progressed past episode 13, this probably would have severely impacted my opinion of this season. But since the arc about Dal and Chakotay in this 2-parter really frames Dal's problem as being that something is bugging him, it really worked on me very, very well, and I will get back to this in a minute. Dal starts lashing out at Chakotay. Chakotay is not having it. He doesn't want these children on his ship. There's an ion storm, which was this very, very Dal-colored shade of purple and white rolling in towards the ship that turned out to be a metaphor for Dal exploding. And he eventually lets the children in, but doesn't want to hear from them. So Dal sort of throws a temper tantrum, but Gwyn decides that they are going to try to pull him out of his depression. Chakotay, I mean. So the children start to just jump in and help Chakotay with whatever he needs, collecting food, cleaning the protostar, in the hopes that they can win him over and have him let them in. It's a very, very charming sequence, but I also want to highlight how interconnected everyone's emotional journeys have been. And not even just emotional journeys, just, the bad and the good things that happen to them have to do with the other people in their lives in a very powerful way. From the very, very beginning, Gwyn was the right hand to the diviner who owned the other children as his slaves. So it took them a while for the children to warm up to and forgive Gwyn and trust her. But after that, we get to this season, and the children have to try to go after Chakotay, and they kind of contribute to his marooning. But Chakotay leaving with the protostar and marooning himself is what destabilizes Gwyn from the timeline. So her injury, her illness this season comes from Chakotay. But Chakotay's depression and, the loss of Adrik Hu, all of that comes from the rest of the children being there trying to save him. And then it is Gwyn and then eventually the other children who help him to get off the planet at all. It's a theme that I particularly like in the context of some of the ideas of today. Unfortunately, I am addicted to Reddit, and there are a lot of, they're fake, by the way, all of those posts are fake, posts on relationship advice and am I the asshole and all that stuff, where people are asking for perspective on a problem they're having interpersonally. And the prevailing idea is that if you have some baggage with a person, it's not worth working through. It's better to just scrub this person from your life and move on. But if you want real depth with other people, that comes from working through things with them. That's not to say that someone should stay in a toxic relationship or anything like that, but that people helping each other in times of need is the foundation of, society and happiness. I really hate this goatee. I have never in my life felt anything like gender dysphoria. I hate looking like a man. I do not like this at all. So we have to take a second to talk about the way Star Trek series are constructed. We have talked in the past on this channel many times about the love triangle. How a story is typically formatted as a protagonist having to choose between two ideals in the form of a person. It doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic love triangle. It could be, choosing between your family or the outsider that you've fallen in love with or whatever. But typically, there are two ideals that a person has to prioritize in the form of a person or people, and the protagonist has to choose between these two things. The person that they choose is usually pretty obvious because the deuteragonist of the story carries the primary theme. In The Hunger Games, Katniss has to choose between Gale and Peeta. Gale is a cynic, and Peeta is an optimist. And Katniss requires optimism and hope because things are so dark. And the idea behind The Hunger Games is that you have to continue to try to make things better. If she had chosen Gale, the story would have not made sense on a thematic level. So your deuteragonist carries the themes of the story. In The Good Place, the deuteragonist of the story is Chidi. The protagonist, Eleanor, is a bad person who dies and wants to get into heaven, and she befriends and later falls in love with a philosophy professor who teaches her about various moral philosophy concepts. She eventually develops a passion for moral philosophy, And the story of The Good Place overall explores a wide variety of pretty elementary but still interesting moral philosophical concepts each episode. It deals with, the nature of good and evil, and whether intent matters, and the trolley problem, and heaven and hell, and all that sort of stuff. And all of those things are encompassed in the relationship between Eleanor and Chidi, a bad person looking to be better, and the teacher who is teaching her to be better, right? Without Chidi, The Good Place itself has no point. In Star Trek series, the deuteragonist is almost always the first officer. Back in the TOS era, there was a real problem. Well, I don't know if you would call it a real problem. Just a problem. I wonder sometimes how Star Trek would have turned out if certain creative decisions had been made differently, and this is one of the most important ones. In season 1, Spock was the most popular character by a very wide margin. People really, 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 really liked Spock, and Kirk was there too. So Gene Roddenberry was looking to improve Kirk in the eyes of the audience for the second season in order to increase the overall power of the show. If everybody is coming just to watch Spock, that's kind of a problem, right? You want them to like the whole cast. You especially want them to like your lead. So he consulted with a friend of his, Isaac Asimov, yes, that one, on a couple of ideas to improve the series going into season 2. There are a lot of these letters, but I'm going to pull out just this one and read you some of the highlights. The chief practical reason for its success is Mr. Spock. The excellence of the stories and the acting brings in the intelligent audience, but Mr. Spock brings in the teenage vote, which does send the ratings over the top. Therefore, nothing can or should be done about that. Besides, Mr. Spock is a wonderful character, and I would be most reluctant to change him in any way. The problem then is how to convince the world and Mr. Shatner that Mr. Shatner is the lead. It might be well to unify the team of Kirk and Spock a bit by having them actively meet various menaces together, with one saving the life of the other on occasion. The idea of this would be to get people to think of Kirk when they think of Spock. And finally, the most important suggestion of all, ignore this letter unless it happens to make sense to you. Isaac. And then the response. Isaac, your comments on Shatner and Spock were most interesting, and I have passed them on to Gene, Kuhn, and others. We followed one idea immediately, that of having Spock save his captain's life in an upcoming show. I will follow your advice about having them much more a team, standing more closely together. As for having Shatner play more varied roles, we have been looking in that direction and will continue to do so. But I think the most important comment is that of keeping them a close team. Shatner will come off ahead by showing he is fond of the teenage idol. Spock will do well by displaying great loyalty to his captain. In a way, it will give us one lead, the team. Gene. And that's the origin of Spurk. Season 2, Episode 1 of TOS is Amok Time, which is the one where it's the very first Pon Farr episode, the one where Spock goes into Pon Farr and fights Kirk to the death and thinks that he killed him, and then angsts about it, and the show starts to play up the connection between Kirk and Spock for the benefit of the audience and the show, and it spawned a cultural movement that cannot be understated. Star Trek was one of the first real fandoms. Housewives and working women would write Spurk fanfic and print it out on paper and mail it to each other, and that was what they did before AO3. We owe fanfic and fandom culture today to this letter from Isaac Asimov. But why was Spock such a compelling character? God, I hate this goatee. Because he was the deuteragonist, and he carried the themes of the show. He was different than all of the other characters. If Kirk had been the only human on an all-Vulcan ship, Spock would not have been nearly so interesting. But Spock is the mirror that humanity bounces off. Spock is the only alien on board Kirk's Enterprise, and he offers the alien's perspective. When Kirk has an idea, Spock gives his opinion that is in many times supposed to be obviously wrong to show the strength of the human spirit. Or he gives an opinion that is obviously right to show the depth of human stupidity. Spock being half human, spends a lot of time waxing poetic about the nature of humanity and the pull between the two sides of him, humanity being the part that he struggles with because the story is really about humans and the humans in the audience. So almost all of the Star Trek series follow this paradigm to some extent. In TOS, the series is about meeting aliens in the vaguest sense at this point, and so the deuteragonist is the alien on the ship who provides that mirror for us. I haven't seen much of Deep Space Nine yet. However, a lot of it has to do with the Cardassian-Bajoran conflict, and the first officer, Major Kira, is a Bajoran freedom fighter. Enterprise deals a lot with the founding of the Federation and humanity's path towards getting along with other species, principally their best buddies, the Vulcans. So the first officer in Enterprise, T'Pol, is a Vulcan. Additionally, Archer is very new to captaining and being on a starship and exploring the galaxy, so T'Pol is someone who is very by the book, who provides that mirror for the decisions that he makes. In a very Kirk and Spock kind of way, Archer makes a suggestion, and T'Pol makes a suggestion that says, "Why would you do that? Vulcans would do it this way." This is intended to cause the audience to think about which perspective is right. TNG and Voyager are two weird cases. In the case of TNG, they were not really sure that they were going to actually be able to make a series with Jean-Luc Picard as the lead work. He is much more even keel than Kirk is. He's obviously a very, very different character than Kirk. So the idea was that maybe they could kill him off and make Riker the captain. That's why in the very first episode they established that Riker is a capable captain in and of himself. So there are two characters who encompass the role that would have been the deuteragonist if Riker had been the captain. That's Troy and Data. Troy is this symbol of the more holistic, mental health focused, evolved future that TNG represents relative to TOS. And Data is that mirror of humanity that we have seen in other cases. The concept of Data being a person who develops an understanding of human emotions is kind of similar to Spock, but it comes from a different place, one that's more appropriate to the tone and themes of TNG. He's more like a child who is growing into maturity than someone who comes at it from a more cynical perspective like Spock's. Not to mention the fact that Spock is an alien, at least half an alien, but Data's origin is a bit closer to Earth. So I hope I've convinced you that the deuteragonist is in some ways supposed to be a little bit more important than the protagonist in some ways. Ignore TNG, kind of. In every other case, the deuteragonist, typically the first officer, carries the story, carries the themes of the story, and is usually the heart of the ship. Prodigy follows this paradigm closer than most. Gwyn is very, very much the heart of the ship. At first she sleeps in their basement, the brig. The ship seems to resemble her very much. She has a pale gray complexion with blue lights and black detailing and these sort of spade shapes that obviously, maybe not obviously, plays very, very nicely with the aesthetic of the protostar. On top of that, obviously the story is mostly about her, and everyone else is largely along for the ride. At one point, I thought about putting in a previous video something like, Gwyn is not Dal's love interest because he's the main character. He is the main character because she loves him. So for this whole series, we've been building up to who is the true captain of the protostar, and it's Chakotay. And the most important thing to Chakotay, the most important thing in his life, is that at one point, he was Janeway's first officer. So a couple months ago, I was scrolling through the Star Trek subreddit, because that's all I do, and it was from Lazy Protection 2210, and the title was, "What are your unpopular or most controversial Star Trek opinions?" But I found this one comment that really stuck with me. From Cat Starcatcher, it says, "Chakotay is a great example of positive masculinity. When he finds himself stranded in a different quadrant, he makes the eminently practical decision to join forces with the enemy in order to keep his crew alive. He never once complains about being suddenly demoted from captain to first officer, or that his new boss is a woman. He's in touch with his emotions and acts as unofficial ship's counselor to a crew that desperately needs one. He treats female coworkers with respect. He never talks about the hot Delaney twins looking at you, Tom and Harry. Despite having feelings for his boss, he never attempts to make a move or pressure her in any way, apart from the few months that one time when she's not technically his boss anymore. He's a vegetarian, but doesn't bang on about it all the time. If disagreeing with Janeway, he does it respectfully and shuts up after she makes her decision. He's slow to anger and uses force only when necessary. He's excellent at household tasks and will build you a bath in a matter of hours. He's the least smug male member of the crew, with the possible exception of Tuvok and Neelix, and he's just an all-around pleasant person. Obviously ignoring the whole Native American shit show, because even I can't admit that. I already liked Chakotay before I read this comment, but it definitely made me feel justified in liking him when basically every other comment I ever see about Chakotay is overwhelmingly negative. It's astonishing how quickly Chakotay becomes the obvious captain of the Protostar. And I don't mean in the literal sense. I mean, he walks around with this gaggle of children, and it is obvious that he is their leader. And it fits so well. Because he is the person that this comment describes. He is kind and compassionate and a capable leader. He's very stable. The mere fact that he was able to retain his mind in the 10 years that he was stranded on this island is impressive in and of itself. There's obviously a lot of positive that could be said about the writing in Prodigy. It is not at all a stretch to call it the strongest writing in New Trek, at least. But I think that what Prodigy does best, potentially, is direct your expectations and attention in a way that you only kind of understand. I usually watch these episodes twice before I do a video analysis, and I find that the foreshadowing in this is far beyond the foreshadowing in most other things. I don't just mean in Star Trek, I mean in general. In this specific case, I'm referring to the death of Adric Hu. So I mentioned previously that I joined the Prodigy Discord server really truly to just to find out when the new season was coming out. I'm not a nerd or anything. And there were a bunch of people already in the server who were really knowledgeable about Prodigy and really knowledgeable about Star Trek. A lot of these people have watched every episode when it came out since TNG and stuff. And there was a character that they would talk about all the time named Adric Hu. And I thought that it was, somebody's OC or somebody's alter ego, right? For the most part, I tuned this out. I don't participate in that part of the fandom as much. But eventually I scrolled past something, and it was an actual screenshot of Adric from season 1 in one of the 5 frames he shows up in. And I went, wait a second, you guys are talking about a real character? They were like, yeah, no, Chakotay's first officer, the Birdman. And I was like, what? So when Adric showed up in the first couple of episodes of season 2, I thought that it was a cool treat for all of those people in the Prodigy Discord who cared about Adric Hu for some reason. And I did think that he was a cool character. I thought that it was neat that they had given Chakotay a new friend, I guess you could say. I would like to show this show to a person with no knowledge and say, okay, spot which of these characters came from Voyager and which of them didn't, and try to see who is who. And I actually think that you could not tell Adric Hu is nobody. He's treated very much like just another character, with a little bit less reverence, but he is treated as a person. At first, we are kind of led to believe that he died, but then it turns out that he just left. And you go, oh, okay, this is a cartoon, right? They're going to go find him, and the kids are like, oh, we'll go find Adric, and then Dal finds his corpse. And you see this bird skeleton that's all dried out, and the bones are breaking. And it was masterful. I mean, that is masterful misdirection. Adric got like 5 lines, and yet his death is one of the most emotionally impactful moments in the series because of how much Chakotay cares for him. Everybody else in Chakotay's crew is dead, and Adrik being dead means that he is the last one. And this is what snaps Chakotay out of his dickishness. He regains his hope and his interest in living life. Maybe my favorite shot of the entire series is where they put Adrik's body in the boat and push it off into the clouds. There's some quote somewhere from Rebecca Sugar, who created Steven Universe, who said something like, you can tell any story in 10 minutes, and if you think you can't, you're wrong or you're not good enough. I don't remember exactly how she said it. I'm sure she didn't say something, you're not good enough. But Steven Universe episodes are 10 minutes long, and a lot of them will just make you cry like a baby. Cartoon creators have to do more with less. And that's what I've always said impressed me about Prodigy. They do more with less. They can show less darkness, and yet there is more of it. There's less time, and yet there's more story. Whether or not you believe you can, you are right. And that is demonstrated incredibly effectively with the death of Adrik, a guy who probably has 4 total minutes of screen time. Alright, it's time for me to tell another personal story. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, this is the me telling personal stories that relate to Star Trek Episodes channel. So, and sometimes I read books too. I know this channel's called Octopus Literary, and it's been like probably a couple of years since I covered a book. But this is the me personal stories channel, so it's here we go. So when I was, the story is about Dal, by the way. I mean, it's about me, but it ties back into being about Dal. So when I was in high school, I was the operator on my robotics team. So I was in what's called First Robotics Competition, which is a competition for high schoolers where they build a 120-pound robot that needs to play a sport. It could be basketball, it could be soccer, something. You find out what the sport is, you have 6 weeks to build the robot, and then over the course of the next few months you compete with it. Most teams, including mine, split the driving of this robot into 2 people, the driver and the operator. The driver moved the literal wheels, directed the movement of the robot, and the operator operated the arms or did the shooting or, did the little mechanical things on the robot. In my sophomore and junior year, I was the operator, and we had a robot that needed to shoot. I needed to be very, very good at looking at the numbers for how fast our flywheel was spinning or whatever, and judging our distance to the goal and knowing how powerful I needed to make the shot or when I needed to make the shot, depending on how the robot was designed that year. So what I did on the team mostly, I did do a little bit of machining, and I didn't even program, which is ironic because I became a computer programmer. But for the most part, what I did was I would walk around and scout other teams. I actually watched a lot of matches on YouTube, so I would look at the capabilities of other robots. I would make strategies for how to combat various teams, and then we executed them. I was extremely good at this. That's not bragging, it's a fact. Outside of the World Championship, in my sophomore and junior years, I lost like 3 matches, I think, total, out of about 30. I was a very, very good operator. Now, the most important part of this story is that the driver was my boyfriend. Kind of. He was kind of my boyfriend. We were an exceptional team. He would come over, we would watch matches, we would take notes together. We spent a lot of time outside of school together, watching matches. Basically, I guess you could say we were drift compatible. We had this sort of pseudo-sexual tension that allowed us to together pilot a robot very, very well. Shortly before we became the driver-operator team, I developed a crush on him, and shortly after, he asked me to homecoming, and we kind of danced around the idea of dating for the next year and a half. We held hands, we snuggled on long bus rides, but I would always call him my boyfriend when he wasn't around. The The rest of the team knew that we were sort of together, but we never called each other anything official in front of each other, because we just never talked about it. We did not address the topic because we were both very shy, and I did not bring it up because I was afraid. I figured that things were going well. You know, the guy I liked seemed to like me, and I could hold his hand and snuggle with him on the bus. And if I touched it, it might break. So at one point we went on this date to the park to fly some kites, and he told me this awful, awful story about this prank that he had pulled on his sisters. I'm cutting that for time, but I realized that he was an asshole, and I stopped talking to him for a couple of weeks. And then I changed my mind, and I felt really bad about it, so I wanted to be with him again, and he ghosted me. I started trying to show him that I liked him and texting him all the time, and I became what could now be easily recognized as a stalker, but I just didn't realize that he wasn't interested in me anymore. He told me that he had too much calculus homework to hang out anymore, and that his phone was acting up, so I would send him like 96 text messages at a time. And I slowly started to realize that he was serious about not liking me anymore. And it broke me. This is sounding melodramatic, I'm sure, but it had never occurred to me that I could be rejected before. And I started to cry for literally 10 hours a day. I scheduled time during my day to cry so that my parents could not know that I was crying. I would schedule long blocks of time that were available for me to shower so that I could cry in the shower. I was in a digital media class at my school, and I went into the digital media lab a lot to work on my homework for that because it was dark and I could sit in the back of the classroom and cry. I had to start listening to shitty celebrity talk radio shows on the way to and from school so that I would not cry while I was driving in the car. This sounds very silly, but I still consider this to be the darkest point in my life. What's important to understand is that I thought that if a relationship didn't work out, then that meant that I had failed. Especially because in this case, it so clearly to me seemed to be my fault. And I didn't want it to be my fault. So I decided pretty early into this whole thing that I was going to try to get him to propose to me within the next 6 months because we were going off to college. And I did everything I possibly could to make this happen. I baked him brownies, which he left on the table in the machine shop for weeks at a time. I sent him 96 text messages in a row, as I said. I found his account on Chief Delphi, which was the forum that people could use to discuss various aspects of our robotics league. And I started messaging his account on there because he said there was something wrong with his phone. And I genuinely at this point had not realized that that was a euphemism for I don't like you no more. And the cognitive dissonance was killing me. I became a nightmare. At my absolute lowest point, I actually saw him talking to a college advisor that I had been talking to. He was waiting in line at lunch. So I actually called her and asked her what they had talked about, because I wanted to know where he was going to school so that I could go with him. I was that bad. So I was a walking disaster. I truly, in many ways, lost my mind. But worst of all of this was that I lost the ability to operate the robot. The most important thing in the world to me was that I could operate the robot. I was so good at it. In my mind, I was one of the best operators that there was. But that year, we had changed the way the drivetrain worked. We had, for my entire time in the robotics team, we had a 6-wheel drivetrain, so, 3 wheels on each side in front of each other. The middle one was slightly lowered so that it helped with turning. And all of our robots were like that to make it easy for us to train in the off-season. But that year we decided to go with the holonomic drive, which allows the robot to strafe and drive in a variety of directions like this. And it would have been really, really neat if I had still gotten along with the guy I had been seeing at this time, because what we ended up doing was drastically changing the way the controls worked. Instead of having one person operate the drivetrain and the other person operate the mechanisms, instead we split the robot down the middle. So one person drove the left side of the robot and operated the left arms, and the other person operated the right side of the drivetrain and the right arm. This was exceptionally difficult to wrap my mind around, but I should have been able to do it. It is completely something that I should have understood. I had been a backup driver in my freshman year. I had been one of the best operators in the world for the next 2 years, and I had spent many, many, many hours of my life obsessively driving robots. I should have been able to drive that robot. But everything else going on in my life meant that I couldn't do anything. But most importantly, I couldn't do the one thing that made me happy. The thing that I could do that defined how I saw myself. I felt so stupid. I felt like I couldn't do anything. Not only did the boy that I liked not like me anymore, an eventuality that, as silly as it sounds, I had never considered would possibly be in the cards. I couldn't drive the robot. I think that's why watching this two-parter hurt so much. Now, that was the important part of that story, but I will share what pulled me out of this in case anybody is in a similar situation or knows someone who is. So for one, I finally had an honest one-on-one conversation with this boy. December 23rd, we had gone on the date to the park, and January 10th or so was when I started to detect that things were seriously wrong. And then I went into absolute free fall for the next couple of months. March 26th of that year, I pulled him to the side and I said, I want to know what's going on. It's like you don't want me to like you anymore. And he said, that's completely incorrect. I don't care what you think of me. This was the first step to actually going back on the upswing. I had to cleanly get actually rejected. But on top of that, I had to have a real confrontation with him in order for us to come to an understanding. Previously, what I had been doing was using my imagination to try to figure out what he wanted. And that's wrong. That's not science. But secondly, I shared this in my original bingo prediction video, but I met my roommate that I lived with in college, and she was really into Steven Universe, and I wanted to be her friend, so I got really, really, really into Steven Universe for her. Getting my mind onto something else and letting go of this boy was really what I needed. Particularly in this case, I was doing it for the sake of someone else. So in these two episodes, we see the aftermath of Dal finding out that he will at some point come to the conclusion that he cannot be a starship captain, and he goes into absolute freefall. Things have been going to shit in his life for the past couple of months. He has been cooped up on a tiny shuttlecraft with a bunch of his friends who are annoyed with him and his ego problems. His girlfriend is dying. His hero, this person he has built up as being someone he should look up to, has disappointed him, and he has started to screw up publicly in a couple of ways. And it is finally getting to him, and it makes him crack in a big way. And Chakotay, being a generally very emotionally intelligent person, realizes that Dal is having this problem and actually tries to help him solve it by giving him responsibility. However, Dal lets him down at every turn. Several times he snaps at Chakotay and criticizes his leadership. Whenever he's given small tasks, he flubs them. He lets Dal try to tow the protostar through sand, even though there's a giant boulder that he doesn't have any interest in trying to move. But eventually he allows Dal to steer the ship when they're sailing it through a bunch of clouds. And Dal is so just messed up and anxious about doing it right and distracted and tense that he forgets that the controls are inverted. Left is right, right is left. And he steers the ship into a bunch of rocks. Gwen has to run over and wrestle control away from him, And Chakotay says that Gwyn will be steering the ship from now on, and that Dal needs to coil the ropes. It is hard to watch, and it is done so effectively that this made me genuinely really worried about the writing quality, because if this is pulled off, it's great. And if it's not pulled off, you have ruined a character that I, up to this point, really, really liked. But eventually, Chakotay comes up to Dal and talks to him and says, all right, I know that there's something on your mind, and if you want to talk about it, I'm here. And the thing is that Dal cannot tell anyone but Chakotay about the vision that he saw of the future. If Dal is handing Gwyn captaincy of the ship, then that means Chakotay is not the captain, but everybody else will presumably be taking orders from Gwyn. So Chakotay is the one person he could conceivably talk to about this, except maybe hologram Janeway. And they have this conversation that was so good, I had to write down the lines. And Dal says, I know how to put on a brave face, just long enough to get by, but if I'm not good enough to lead, what good am I to them? This is kind of not what I was expecting from Dal at this point. He had been on such an ego trip for so long that I kind of suspected that this was also an ego thing. But he knows that he doesn't really have any useful skills specifically that are not leadership. If Chakotay is in charge, if Gwyn is in charge, he is coiling the ropes because he doesn't have anything else specific that he could be doing. But I was also really, really impressed with this level of self-awareness. That's not to say that I thought that Dal wasn't self-aware, just that this is a level of self-awareness that most people, in general, on average, do not have. We are going to get back to that part of this topic later on in this video. But Chakotay responds with this. He says that he was also lost when he was Dal's age, and that he thought he could find himself within the Maquis. But I never truly belonged until I became Janeway's number one. I wasn't a captain, but we shared something greater. A cause I believed in. The point is, maybe you'll be captain, maybe not. But whenever you're feeling lost, it's best to find where you're needed most. And right now, you are needed on rope duty. I loved this. It's advice that's so good it fixes Dal, thank God. It works on several levels. For one, Dal is not needed as the captain right now, but there are other things he could be doing. Later on in this episode, he saves Chakotay when Chakotay falls overboard because he has the situational awareness to dive into action. What Dal really needed was to take this issue outside of himself. It had become a matter of ego to him, which was what was causing his suffering. Chakotay encourages him to separate the idea of being captain from his ego, which is what we highlighted last week as being his problem. If he wants to be captain because he wants to help the people around him, then shouldn't it be good enough to just help the people around him, even if it means doing something else? One of my favorite things about the series is that their party comp is so terrible. Everyone has completely disparate, mismatched skills that are in many ways redundant. Murph is the security officer, but Gwyn could easily be the security officer. Dal could arguably be the security officer. Gwyn angst a couple of times about the fact that she's the translator when they don't even need one. They have a couple of people who are okay at piloting, but it's totally unnecessary since Janeway flies the ship. But the flip side of this is that Dal actually has several minor skills that he could use at any given time. I really like the fact that the show didn't say, okay, Dal's one talent is leadership, and this is the only thing he can do. That's not realistic. That's not what real people are like. So from this point on, at least in this set of episodes, what Dal does is just kind of see where he could be useful. He recalibrates some of their tricorders to be able to better pick things up. He saves Chakotay when Chakotay falls off the side of the ship. He joins Nova Squadron as an alternate so that he can pilot one of the fighters if necessary. Finally, of course, there is the toilet paper thin allusion to, I never truly belonged until I became Janeway's number one. He believed in the cause that she was fighting for and decided that he was going to help her with it. There is the obvious subtext of, I wonder, young man, if there is a woman in your life who has a cause that is greater than yours, who may require currently your support. So this is kind of building up this whole series into kind of being an examination of the idea of the first officer. You know, the first officer has always been the most important character in Star Trek shows. Well, not always, but typically. And in this, we've got 3 of them. This show is about the ship that is captained by Janeway's first officer. The plot follows the person who was in the first season of this, the first officer. And the big twist at this point is probably that the main character is going to become the first officer. We've been talking about this episode for a long time, so let's move on to episode 13. Don't worry, I don't have nearly as much to say about the rest of these. Episode 13, I thought started out really, really strong, but I did think that it had the weakest resolution of any of the episodes this season. This is, I think, our first actual Rock Talk episode this season, although she has been important in other episodes. This is the one that's, like, about her. They go to this planet because they are going to build their own protostar from elements that they find in wherever the hell they are. I just want to say, not to shit on Discovery again, but I'm gonna, that I really appreciate this spirit that the show has of showing that, okay, we need this thing, so we're gonna manufacture it ourselves. We know that we need this thing. What do we need to get it? Where do we need to go? The plot is not happening to these people. These people doing things is the plot. They go to this planet that has been infested with tribbles, and we get the equivalent of Barnes Frex, except his inclusion did not piss me off the way that Barnes Frex did. But this is this season's guy who is so stupid it makes the plot work. Fortunately, it's only for this episode, so it's funny instead of being frustrating. But this Klingon scientist, whose honor depends on his ability to solve this dribble problem, earns the pity and desperation of Ruktak, who decides to help him. One through line of the series that I just adore is the awe that Dal always has for Ruktak. He's always hyping her up. He's always talking about how smart she is and how much she can do. At one point in this episode, Chakotay pulls him to the side and says, "Hey, Rock seems smart, but is she actually smart? Can she actually do this?" And Dal goes, "Oh yeah, she rebuilt our warp core and rebuilt Janeway from scratch in 10 minutes, even though that is not what happened, young man." But it's very, very cute. I love their almost sibling-like relationship. It's definitely one of the series' strong points. So what happens in this episode is that Ruktak tries to create a remedy for these giant tribbles so that they will shrink back down and the crew of the protostar will be able to get this mineral that they need to build a new protostar out of this mountain. I love how offended she is at how messy this guy's laboratory is. She keeps sneezing and stuff because he never cleans, and she sneezes into the mix and creates a child. She creates a half bricker, half tribble thing, and they call it Bribble. The way Dal's line is phrased, I thought he was trying to say baby tribble, and I was like, Bribble is such a stupid name for that. But I see now, obviously it was half bricker, half tribble. I feel like an idiot. But, you know, this is like the salamander babies, except it sticks around, right? Ruktak is the first of the crew to accidentally have offspring. Teen mom. But she immediately rejects this thing, which is really, really interesting. She starts talking about how it's an abomination and she made this mistake, and she starts kicking herself for creating this life. And man, she really started drinking Starfleet's Kool-Aid, huh? Dal is like, hey, I'm a genetic hybrid, you know, it's not a moral failing. And she's like, One thing that I was kind of concerned about going into this season is that, does Rock have anywhere for her character development to go? And, you know, she seems so happy. And this episode tells me, oh no, season 3 would be so interesting for her. Because here's my assumption, All right, we're playing Star Trek Prodigy Season 3 bingo right now. We're going to wrap up Gwen's storyline this season. However this ends, if she dies, which she won't, but if she does, either way, this will be over. And then we're going to have to move on to Dal, right? Where did Dal come from? What's his deal? Is he some lab mistake like the Brittle? Or, was he some artificial son for some Geppetto scientist who wanted to create something for themselves and then died? We don't know these things, and that would have to be the next plot line, right? And that's where Rok-Tahk's going to come in, because she has started to, like I said, drink the Kool-Aid. That's not to say that Starfleet is inherently bad, but that blind obedience is inherently bad, and that is kind of maybe a problem that we have seen that Rok-Tahk would be susceptible to. And we see that in this episode. Just a flash of it, but we can definitely see this snowballing. The other thing that happens in this episode is that one of the giant triples runs over poor Zero, who is unable to heal their broken leg. Unfortunately, there's not really much that can be said about this at this point, but we knew this was coming. We knew that Zero's body was just going to be temporary. It's like a treatment for a disease that becomes less effective over time. You got to be grateful for the fact that you have it and try not to think about the fact that it's going to go away. But eventually it is. I know there's obviously some really strong trans allegory here. And I don't mean the fact that Zero is non-binary. I mean you're assigned to a body that has things about it you don't know, that the leaders in your society have not told you everything about, but expect you to behave a certain way about it. And then, it doesn't behave exactly the way that you thought it would, or the way that you want it to, and you cannot be the way that you are. But I am not going to opine on this because obviously, like I said, this is, it's actively frustrating for me to even see the footage of myself with a mustache. Obviously, I'm a huge supporter of trans rights and all that stuff, but I'm definitely not at all trans, and there's not much I can say here. But fortunately, this is not an allegory, it's a metaphor. It can easily be read with the interpretation of, the trans medical experience, but also it's about disability, a degrading body that is not going to get better, and you have to decide what you're going to do about it, and whether you're going to prioritize certain aspects of it or certain other aspects. From this point on, Zero becomes a less physically capable member of the team. They cannot leave the ship as much. They are not able to complete this particular mission, and they are going to have to be careful with themselves for the remainder of the time they have this body. Just like everything else in Prodigy, it's very interesting, very well executed, and very emotionally potent. Since we're on the topic of Zero, I will just say, not to compliment Sandwich and take away from all the massive praise I just gave, but I would like to see, more from Zero and Majel. I know we don't have very much time, but, I don't think they talk to each other basically at all during this entire section. I still don't really know what to think about what's happening there. I don't need some massive plot line like we have with Dal and Gwen. I don't need that at all. But I still feel like, I felt like we didn't understand Majel as much as I wanted to, and in this set of episodes, we didn't get much farther. We did get a conversation between her and Gwen, which I appreciated, but I also felt to some extent, I don't mean to be negative about this because it was a nice scene, but at some point I was like, hang on, did they go, whoopsie, we put both of our teenage girls in relationships, we have to make sure this passes the Bechdel test? Yeah. Again, not even a real complaint. It just kind of colored the way I interpreted that scene. So the stated purpose of Prodigy is to introduce new viewers to Star Trek, right? We need to cover all of the topics that Star Trek typically covers. We gotta have holodeck episodes. We gotta have an episode that explains the transporter, an episode that explains the Kobayashi Maru, an episode that explains First Contact, all of those things. We have to have each type of episode. We have to have, big trolley problems. We have to have big, other types of moral quandaries relating to species that cannot communicate with you in a meaningful way. And also there are horny episodes, and I really didn't think we were going to get one of those in Prodigy, but we did. Episode 14, Cracked Mirror. Most of the depth to this episode I'm going to talk about when we talk about episode 15, but this episode is just fun. They could have technically skipped making this episode. The only important part of this episode is the very end when they get back to Voyager and Janeway and Chakotay get to hug and, say hi to each other for the first time in a long time and all that stuff. But this episode is so much fun. I am definitely not going to judge it for not being necessary. I personally, I will always defend filler. One of the first lines in this episode is Majel being concerned as to whether the protostar can sustain such high speeds for such a long time. And it shows that, she's a pilot. She is thinking about what the ship can handle and its capabilities and stuff. And does this add anything? Yes. I mean, is it necessary? No, but it adds to our understanding of Majel. But when the ship comes out of proto-warp, the presence of Gwyn causes them to jump timelines into a alternate universe where Janeway took the Infinity to Solum, and her, Tysus, and Dr. Noam all died. This did violate the one thing that I said I wanted, which was, clean antimimetics. If the Infinity got eaten by the loom, they should not bring it up again. It would have been okay if the alternate universe doctor had referenced the Infinity, but the children had not talked about it. But then immediately afterwards, they start talking about their time on the Infinity, so they do remember it. I'm trying to decide whether I am judging the series for not being able to keep track of this. There Is No Anti-Mimetics Division is one of my very favorite books, and it not living up to the standards of the book that kind of codified this concept is, understandable, I guess. But at the same time, there's only a handful of things that have been eaten by the loom. And people, commit. The kids get in the elevator and they find that on each deck is a separate dimension, or a separate timeline in which some other choice they had made was made differently and events unfolded differently. Second timeline they visit, they find Okana, who is just a delight to have back. Again, having him back doesn't technically add anything, but it's fun to have him there. He's a great character who still drives Dal nuts. Gwyn gets the opportunity to give him shit for abandoning them. It's great. Rock and Zero take a different elevator because there's too many of them, and they end up on a version of the Voyager manned by Enterprisians and captained by Tuvix, which, it's absurdism, but it was really, really funny. All this is recycling assets, right? Any new object you need to create in 3D CG animation costs money, costs time. So the more you can reuse what you already have, the more efficient your story can be from an animation perspective. That's why the children never change clothes. By the way, I thought that was very conspicuous. The children have not changed clothes at all. Chakotay has had several outfits, a couple different hairstyles. I'm pretty sure that the version of him from the Prime timeline has a bigger, stronger jawline than the Mirror Universe version of him. But the children have never changed clothes, and I am suspicious, more than suspicious, that they will change clothes for some reason in the final couple of episodes. Hoping for it. I hate it. I hated the I thought they were black and white, but it's actually white and dark red. I hated those uniforms when we first saw it at San Diego Comic-Con last year, but they did definitely grow on me. I understand they're trying to keep with the continuity from Picard and try to make those uniforms make sense with what Picard shows us. And they definitely did grow on me after I accepted that this is what the children were going to be wearing. One of my favorite bits from this part was at one point Majel says, we need to get up to the bridge, but we can't take 8 floors up to the bridge because Gwyn will not survive 8 traversals of different timelines. And Gwyn is like, no, I'm not going to be killed by some stupid elevator. I am strong enough to take it. Blah, blah, blah. Yes, totally. So then the kids go to the Mirror Universe. I actually love the Mirror Universe. I loved the season of Discovery that dealt with the Mirror Universe. I watched Mirror Mirror from TOS, and I like that too. I like fun camp. I like silly. And the Mirror Universe is fun camp silly. When the kids go to the Mirror Universe, they encounter a version of Janeway and Chakotay who lead the Voyager A. And you know how most captains in the Mirror Universe have like a consort because everybody's, terminally horny in the Mirror Universe. Well, this Janeway has Chakotay, and it's they push it so far. The kids get locked in the brig, and then they borderline make out with each other in front of them while talking about torture. It's ridiculously silly and over the top, but it's brief enough that it doesn't get old. This part of the episode only starts in the back half of the episode, so it's actually a very, very brief trip to the Mirror Universe. But the gag is, look at how horny Janeway and Chakotay would be around each other if it was acceptable for them to do that. It's a whole lot of ship tease. They make it up to the bridge, and the Loom are attacking, and Chakotay is able to kind of win over the other Janeway by being like, you know that in no universe would I ever hurt you, or whatever. And but then the Loom come in and stop time, and so Gwyn is the only one who can hit the button to charge the deflector shields and send them back to their own universe or whatever. So I got actually a little mad at this. I was like, I thought everybody was wearing the time bracelets so that they would not be stopped by the Loom. But I looked more closely, and all of the children have taken off their life-saving time bracelets like a bunch of idiots. So that's why they couldn't use it. Cause they took them off. They finally make it back to the real Voyager A, and there's a overly saccharine reunion between Janeway and Chakotay. And you are definitely supposed to think that they are in Schrodinger's relationship, especially in the following episode. In this episode and the next one, she's always touching his chest and stroking his face and stuff, and yeah. I understand that people want, like, a literal on-screen wedding to confirm the nature of the relationship between Janeway and Chakotay. But I think the subtext is good enough. Maybe that's not quite it. Watching Voyager, it is very clear that they are saying that Janeway and Chakotay would make a good couple if they were not captain and first officer of this ship. But because they are stranded in the Delta Quadrant, that's not possible. Then, in this series, they are captains of separate ships, and their Mirror Universe counterparts get very, very horny together at the prospect of torturing children. And my rule is, if I showed this to somebody who had not seen Voyager, would they think that Janeway and Chakotay are love interests? And literally every single person watching it would go, yeah, of course, I have eyes. Do I want them to explicitly confirm or deny this? Only if it would further the story. I think they have confirmed it enough because I can see it, personally. Especially with the level to which they parallel Dal and Gwyn with Janeway and Chakotay. I guess we can go ahead and move on to episode 15, but first I want to say Wesley Crusher, the Enterprisians, Tuvix, the Salamanders. I really, really appreciate Lower Decks and Prodigy's commitment to celebrating the smaller parts of Star Trek. You know, it's not about talking to us about how cool Kirk is. It's remember this one character who showed up in this one episode. You know, who is the best person to demonstrate to Dal who he could be? Okana, you know, and that's, I really, really appreciate that about Prodigy. It makes all the references feel very natural. It makes Prodigy feel like it exists very naturally within the universe. And it helps the world to feel lived in when you are drawing on the rest of Star Trek without it becoming about the rest of Star Trek. So episode 15 is Ascension Part 1. I am frankly very glad that this is the only time a two-parter is being split by some of these videos, because this is definitely supposed to be paced like a regular 40-minute episode, but alas. I've said before that my favorite parts of Prodigy from a visual, directorial, animation perspective are the montages, but functionally what that means from a storytelling perspective is that my favorite parts of Prodigy are the captain's logs, or the logs in general, the people giving logs, because they're usually accompanied by a montage. But also, the logs in Prodigy are so committed to showing strong personality. My favorite part of last season was the captain's log that Dal gives about how much he hates Okana. You know, they're able to sneak these very, very rich pieces of character building into the captain's log by having their personalities leak into what they are saying about what's happening. In the case of the Okana captain's log, he was theoretically talking about what was happening on the ship, but in reality, you know, we were finding out that he feels threatened by Okana and that sort of thing. Not to shit on Discovery again, but here we go. It was actually a line in a log from Michael that completely killed my interest or faith in that show. At one point in season 2, actually these were two parts of the same episode, she said, I envy those who believe there is a greater hand writing our story. Which is kind of saying the quiet part out loud. Okay. But the one that really pissed me off was, if I have a path, I'm still searching for it. That's how we all find our way. I'm sure if you haven't seen Discovery, this doesn't sound that bad, but basically, all of the personal logs in Discovery are faux deep. They've got like meaningful quotes or whatever that tangentially relate to whatever's happening, but they are actually very shallow and meaningless. If I have a path, I'm still searching for it. That's how we all find our way. Thank you, Michael. I never would have figured that out. Sorry, I do like Michael. It's not Michael. It's the writing. The writing is bad. So the obvious outward consequence of Dal's character development this season is him coming to terms with potentially not being a starship captain. But the very consistent through line that we have had for his character developing throughout the entire series, especially this season, but you can almost plot it linearly on a graph, is his moving away from the Ferengi way of talking and into a very emotionally honest and self-aware way of communicating. In season 1, we talked about how the majority of the words that came out of his mouth were lies. Every single sentence that he said had to be a means to an end. And then we found out that this came from his mom. Then he finds out that Nandi sold him into slavery, and he realizes that he needs to not be like her anymore. Episode 9, he has this conversation with Gwyn about how he's afraid that if they go back to Tars Lamora to try to rescue the rest of the slaves, everyone will die or be recaptured. And this is the first time that we really see him actually be honest about what he's thinking and feeling. Before this, it was all bloviating. Just Ferengi, I have to have control of the conversation. I have to have control of what people think I'm trying to say. And people can still see through it. We see this happening in little ways throughout the series. as he like slowly gets pulled into actual open, honest communication. But not even gets pulled, like a lot of this is him pulling himself. And so this is something that we see him developing over the course of the series that is a through line that you can kind of use to track how he is doing and how far he's progressing. He tries to talk to Janeway in Crossroads, but he's tongue-tied. He can't get the words out. In the following episode, Masquerade, he tries to become someone he isn't through the power of genetic manipulation, and eventually he admits to Gwyn, I wanted you to look at me the way you look at Okana. It took a lot of prying and disaster for him to get to the point where he said that, but it's not just, I'm mad at you because you looked at Okana that one time. There's a level of self-awareness there that he wasn't acting on in that moment, but he has it. In the first episode of season 2, he's on the phone with Gwyn, and he tries to talk to her about their relationship, and then he walks it back because he's nervous, and then he commits, and he goes, no, actually, I'm trying to be vulnerable with you, and I don't feel like I'm getting anything back. And of course it was because they had lost connection. But he catches himself, and he tries to drag himself back towards the emotional honesty that he is trying to develop. In the last flight of the Protostar, he can't talk to any of his teammates about the future for himself that he saw. So the moment Chakotay offers conversation, he cracks and spills his guts to him. In episode 14 of this season, after they get back from the Mirror Universe, the kids watch Janeway and Chakotay stare longingly into each other's eyes after being reunited after 10 years of being separated. Dal turns to Gwyn and says, there are a lot of timelines out there or whatever, but I am glad that I am in this one with you. And this is actual character development for him. He would have never said, regardless of their relationship status, he would have never said that in season 1. Hell, he wouldn't have even said that, in the last episode of season 1 when they were together. Although he did tell her that he didn't want her to leave. He wouldn't have said in season 1, episode 3, wow, Rock, I really appreciate having you around because I cannot do the things you do. And, thank you for being on my team. At that point in the series, he had to prioritize looking like he was on top and deflecting. So he has really come, really, really far in this department. Especially because people do not develop this level of self-awareness on accident. A person who does not put any effort into self-awareness does not get to the level that Dal is at even now. It takes genuine practice and introspection, which can only be done on purpose. But is it really being done on purpose, right? We've never heard Dal say, yeah, I'm trying to be a more whole person, so I'm thinking about my problems more and putting them into words. I don't think he's doing that. So I thought about it. I actually got into a conversation with my friend who used to watch Steven Universe with me the other day about how we each approach life differently. And one difference that we have is that I am better at articulating my problems and kind of sorting them out, having a sense of this happened and then this happened and then this happened and, this is how I contributed to this, or this is how this other person contributed to this. She has other strengths, but this is not one of them. And we came to the conclusion that the fact that I talk about my problems so much in a variety of ways is why I'm able to articulate them. For one, I'm a big storyteller in group conversation. For two, I journal every day. I used to never be able to do it, but then I started playing Pikmin Bloom. That had a little thing where you could put a note up to 300 characters per day in it, and I would just write what I did every day. And eventually that turned into me actually writing a couple sentences of journal per day, and then that turned into a couple more sentences, and now I write about 3 paragraphs per day about what I did, what I want to do tomorrow, what I'm hoping to achieve tomorrow, and stuff like that. And it really helped me kind of sort through what's happening and what will happen in my life. But finally, if things are really, really bad, if I go through a breakup, or, if something bad happens, I do a video log, kind of not unlike any of the stories that you have heard me tell today about myself. If things are really, really bad, I will sit down with my video camera and I will talk about what happened to myself. And that is what made me realize that what is fixing Dal is the fact that he makes these captain's logs all the time. The fact that they have to do these personal logs is actually making him better. And you can see the difference. Like the very, very first captain's log he ever does, I think is episode 4, he says, yeah, Janeway's making me do this captain's log. She taught us how to do autopilot. That's cool, I guess. I hate this. But the captain's log that he does at the beginning of episode 15, he talks about how, Voyager feels different since he left, even though it looks the same. And he thinks that he no longer defines home as a place, but home as being around the people that he trusts. And he talks about what they are going to be doing with the protostar and how, he wants Gwyn to be okay and all that stuff. And it's night and day different. And so we see that Dal joins Nova Squadron as an alternate, which is really neat. I said last episode that I thought he might join Nova Squadron, and then I was like, shoot. I really hope he does that, because if he doesn't, I'm going to look real stupid. But he did, fortunately. Thank you. And then by the end of this episode, he is flying in Nova Squadron because Essentia is attacking the ship. She has captured the Stargazer. She has been able to speed up the Civil War by manufacturing weapons for some reason. Okay, fine, we'll say it. She captured Wesley Crusher, which was just an incredible plot twist. Like I said, absolutely masterful direction of attention. They bring up a couple of times that she should not have the technology that she does, but they don't allow you to think about it for long enough. They don't bring up Wesley Crusher, but they do bring up time, so you're trying to figure it out. But we've never explicitly paralleled Wesley with time-based technology, even though it would make sense. But the Voyager A is kind of frozen in place, so they have to deploy all the other ships to try to combat it. So Chakotay takes most of the children over to the protostar, including taking Gwyn as his first officer, and Dal going with Majel to fly a fighter. Voyager A itself cannot move, but it can fire, but they cannot access their own sensors, so they don't know where to target. The idea being that the Nova flyers can go in, scan the Rev 1, get the location of the weak points on their ship, send it back to Voyager, and Voyager can target their torpedoes where they need to be targeted in order to disable the Rev 1. This doesn't work because the Nova flyers are chased by a bunch of drones that eventually create a lattice that disables all of the ships, including the Nova flyers and the protostar. And at the end of the episode, everybody is sitting ducks, and then of course it's revealed that Essentia has kidnapped Wesley Crusher and is using his tactical mind to direct the battle. Yet another one of those ridiculously dark Prodigy plot points that is technically okay in a children's show, because we're not actually seeing Wesley Crusher die on screen. We're just seeing him be used against his will to kill people, which is fine. So I actually was able to hit almost all of the points that I wanted to hit during the coverage of all of these, but I do want to bring something up. One thing that has improved vastly between season 1 and season 2 is whenever the cast needs to say something in unison. I am guessing that this might have something to do with COVID. So in season 1, whenever everyone needed to say something at the same time, they used voices that were obviously wrong. I suspect it was actually not the real voice actors, but they were definitely... It sounded very bad. It sounded like it was recorded separately from everything else. And it was usually the kids all cheering together in a very creepy unison. In this set of episodes, a couple of times we hear everybody gasp in unison or chant something together, and it sounds real. I think the difference is that they are using the actual voice actors. I thoroughly believe that the lines that everyone said together in season 1 should have just been cut because they sounded so bad. At one point when they're scooping ice cream and they say "pile it on" every time someone trauma dumps. It sounds so wrong. It sounds like they took a couple of people from around the studio to say it and not the real voice actors. or something. I'm not sure that's actually it. But I'm really, really glad they fixed that in season 2 because it was bad. So that's our excruciatingly lengthy coverage of Star Trek Prodigy this week. But before we exit out, we are going to go back to our bingo sheet and see how this goes. So, Neelix. I had given up on this one, but I'm actually going to count this. So, Captain Tuvix is referenced in episode 14, which wouldn't be enough. But what pushed it over the edge for me is that later Zero and Majel talk about how Captain Tuvix prepared for them a meal that was a fusion of Vulcan and Talaxian cuisines, which is obviously a very, very direct reference to the fact that Neelix was the chef in Voyager. So, this is green. Valnicott used genetic engineering. No, they don't. Return of the Rev 12. So close, but unfortunately, it's the Rev 1. Dal Gwyn, psychic something. Actually, this one, in my opinion, is a little tiny bit back on the table. There is no longer a conflict between them so much, and the most foreboding thing I have ever seen happens in episode 15. The two of them are about to part ways and go on to their separate ships, and they stop and look at each other, and Dal says, "See you on the other side," which is, what hologram Janeway said before she died. And Gwyn says, "Not if I see you first." And then there's a shot of the two of them standing in the hallway on opposite sides, and it lingers there for 3 seconds, and then they walk in opposite directions. And I know for a fact that neither of them can possibly die before episode 19. It's just not going to happen. They're the two main characters. I'm not saying they have plot armor. I'm saying that for now, they can't get killed. And yet, I still felt a lot of dread in that moment. They just very successfully made a whole lot of death flags. So they're definitely telegraphing that something has to happen, something bad has to happen in order for, them to be reunited. Personally, I would say my prediction is that something bad is going to happen to somebody else, that this was misdirection. They want us to be afraid for these two people who are definitely not in danger, but actually we need to be afraid of something else happening that's even worse somehow. But the alternative is that maybe, I kind of don't think this is going to happen, but maybe. I think it's back on the table is what I'm getting at. It's possible. Evil augment. I cannot count poor Bribble as evil, even if Rock thinks so. EMH discusses 7 of 9. Nope. Salamander as serious topic. So we did get the heart-to-heart between Dal and a parental figure that I was predicting we would get on the topic of, him potentially not being a starship captain. So I was pretty close, but for one, it came from Chakotay and not Janeway. And for two, it had nothing to do with salamanders, so Zero has feelings for Gwyn. Somehow even less likely than it was last week when I said that wasn't going to happen. Goatee! Heck yeah! We get Murph and Chakotay with the goatee. I did say that I predicted that it would be Dal, but I didn't actually put that in the square. So if it's not in the square, I'm counting it. Next, avoid obvious America parallel. Again, we can't actually judge this one until the last episode. Destruction of Mars. I kinda think this might come up now. They have brought up the Romulan supernova evacuation a couple of times. I still don't think it's super likely, given, there's 5 episodes left and each of them are half as long as any other Star Trek episode. But a whole lot has happened. In these 5 episodes, they completely rebuilt the protostar, created almost created the character of Chakotay within Prodigy, made him the captain of the ship, fixed Dal's problems, brought back Essentia. All of these things happened in these 5 episodes. So I think there's a distant possibility that Mars could blow up before the end of this season. Dal cites a Starfleet regulation. Maybe. He might. Dal leaves. We can't know that one until the end. Kids tell the other crew about their time on the Protostar. I think I gotta rewatch in order to judge this one. They do sort of. They talk to Hologram Janeway about the fact that they knew her at some point, and, she says she feels like she already knows them because they are comfortable around her and stuff. But I would need, an actual conversation about the time that they spent on the Protostar, and not just Dal being like, oh, this is my ship, or whatever. So I'm gonna have to go back. I haven't rewatched that episode yet, so when I go back, I will make a judgment on that. Finally, clean reference to something filthy. If we're not counting just the entirety of episode 14, I will count a specific line that Dal has in episode 14. At the very beginning of the episode, Chakotay shaves, and he comes out onto the bridge, and Dal says something like, someone looks like he's ready to go to the Admiral's ready room, which unfortunately will have ruined my understanding of the term ready room for the next couple of months. But it's definitely supposed to be at least a little bit of an innuendo. Gwyn punches him for saying so, and then with everything else that happens in that episode, it is retroactively made into more and more of an innuendo. And if that doesn't count, the very clear implication that torturing makes Mirror Universe Janeway and Chakotay very horny is, I was pretty worried about this square, actually. I was kind of wondering if maybe, because they were having to be more plot heavy this season and darker things needed to be happening, Nickelodeon told them that they needed to roll back any filthy jokes because, we are having Wesley Crusher be forced to pilot an evil ship on screen or whatever. So I thought maybe we were not going to get this one. But looks like that's happening. Or it definitely happened, shall we say. So are any of these possible? I think, obviously, this one, avoid Obvious America Parallel. If that happens, then we're home free on this row column. Dal could still leave. Interestingly, I think that this is way less likely now. 2 things. For one, a lot of my basis for Dal leaving was the fact that Gwyn left last season. And the fact that she's back definitely plays against that. But I wasn't too concerned about it because she never expressed any actual interest in Starfleet. Now that Chakotay is using her as his first officer, she has been shuffled over pretty far to the Starfleet side of the board. And, she hasn't said, I want to join Starfleet now because Chakotay is my personal hero. But it definitely pulled her pretty strongly in that direction. And then second of all, now that Dal has joined Nova Squadron, he actually has something that he can do that he can be interested in. Now, do I think that that substitutes for the fact that Dal has not really had an interest in most of Starfleet's activities up until this point? No. I still think it's entirely possible that he leaves. But it is less likely. It's too bad that these 4 cannot be used as a diagonal because look at how nice that looks. Oh well. See you at the next one.